DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
Hi, this is Alex Stein, co-host of Mushing Radio on DogWorks Radio. We just completed our first storytelling season on the 1925 Serum Run. Almost 100 years later, the 1925 Serum Run is something that is still inspirational, amazing, and in many ways larger than life. We've gathered all of these episodes together on one page to make it easier for you to listen to them in order. Just go to dogworksradio.com/serumrun. That's SERUMRUN, no space, dogworksradio.com/serumrun. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to DogWorks Radio at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is that you go to listen to podcasts.
Start your day tomorrow with The Daily Dog with Michelle Forto, the morning podcast on DogWorks Radio. Apple Podcast reviewer Patty Christensen calls it funny, smart, and filled with all the info I want to know about dogs. I love this show. Wake up with The Daily Dog, available on DogWorks Radio on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your shows.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello, welcome everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to our daily coverage of the 2018 Iditarod here on Mushing Radio. You can find us over on dogworksradio.com, also over on KVRF 89.7 here in the Matsu Valley, and our podcast just about everywhere you can find a podcast. Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more. Just search for DogWorks Radio, and if you like what you hear, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review, good, bad, or indifferent. It always helps people finding our show. And joining us from California is our co-host. His name is Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going?
It's going really well, Robert. We have 25 teams are already in Nome. The 26th team probably will be there within the hour. We've got 3 scratches today, and the race just keeps chugging on. It started out slowly, but it feels like it is gaining a little speed as we're reaching the finish. And we've got the 2 back of the Packers going for the Red Lantern. Steve Watkins and Tara Ciccatello are in Unilocleat. So we have the entire race is on the Bering Coast right now.
Awesome. I think I was reading up on some reports and some stories earlier this morning, and I think that everyone should be in Nome by the time of the banquet. Is that what you think of as well?
Yeah, I believe so. If not, by the time the banquet starts, then into the banquet. And what happens in the banquet, which takes place at it starts at 4 p.m. on Sunday, is if the siren goes off, there's a tradition that everyone leaves the banquet and goes down to the Burled Arch to welcome in the late finishers.
That's awesome. I would love to see that kind of sportsmanship and congratulations when those last few mushers come in, especially that Red Lantern, because it's a special thing. Even though they're in last place, it's a really special award for those folks, and it's kind of a coveted award, to say that you're a Red Lantern winner. It's not necessarily coveted meaning, wow, you got, you did a spectacular race or whatever in terms of time or whatnot, but just to be able to have the perseverance and the tenacity to be able to finish the race and get that special award that only a few people have gotten. What is this, the 43rd or 44th running now?
Yeah, but not
Okay,
very many
good.
people, and I think there's only one person who's won the Red Lantern more than once.
Right. And as we mentioned yesterday, they do have the banquet on on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock Alaska time. That goes well into the evening. It's a big party atmosphere. All of the mushers can come up and thank just about anybody they like. I think they have pretty much an open mic. They can talk for as long as they like, unlike the the starting banquet or the drawing banquet there in Anchorage, where they just have a couple of minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, and generally mushers will tell trail stories. They'll thank their sponsors. They'll talk about the things that were important to them. But it's not broadcast, so it's a real chance for people to let their hair down a little bit. And sometimes you get really moving and amazing stories there, and it's a very different kind of atmosphere. I wanted to mention, before we get too far into this, that the one big piece of news that we have today is, unfortunately, there was a dog who died. It was a 5-year-old dog from Catherine Keith's team named Blondie, who was dropped in Koyuk, some signs of early stages of pneumonia, was being treated by the vets, and was waiting to be flown to Anchorage. Was actually the first dog on the priority list of dogs to be flown out, and died around 12:15 this morning while under veterinary care. Probably of pneumonia. They'll do a necroscopy to determine the exact cause of death. But that was the first dog death that we'd had this year, and I hadn't even realized it or thought about it. But we had gone very, very far into the race without any dog deaths. And, of course, you always want for there not to be any dog deaths at all. But, this sounds like it was – I'm not sure what it sounds like. It sounds like the dog was very sick and needed more care than he could get at the checkpoint.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. First off, Koyuk is one of those lesser populated checkpoints. I know we've talked about it in the last few days about sort of the hubs of Iditarod being Anchorage, McGrath, and then Unalakleet, and all of the and of course Nome. But all of the other checkpoints along the way are much less accessible by airplane and whatnot to get dogs in and out, people in and out, gear in and out, etc. So I'm sure, as you mentioned, this dog here was definitely checked out by the veterinarians and then on that priority list, as you mentioned. And the next thing I want to mention in regards to that, it's brought up a lot in the animal rights circles that this is a very cruel race and dogs die all the time, and it's detrimental to the dog's health. And I wanted just to give a personal perspective or a musher's perspective on it. First off, I've been dog mushing since 1994. I've ran in many mid-distance races over several days. I have not ran Iditarod or the Yukon Quest yet, but I definitely have the experience of multi-day racing. And I am very thankful to say that in all of the years that I've been mushing, all of the training runs that I have done, I have never had a dog die on me, either on the gangline during a race, which is sometimes how they die. Often that's a cardiac problem where a dog will have, a heart attack, just like people will exercising. Nor have I ever had a dog die at a checkpoint. And now I'm not trying to toot my own horn on dog care or anything like that, but at least for me, in all of the years that I've been mushing, it's never happened. So I think that that's sort of a testament of just how rare of an occurrence it is. And I have probably, 15,000, maybe closer to 20,000 training miles in the last 8 years or so since arriving in Alaska. So, I think that you're aware of it as of most of the more hardcore fans. It's a rare occurrence, isn't it, Alex?
It really is, and we had several years in a row where there were absolutely zero dog deaths. I think it was 3 or 4 years in a row, and since then, unfortunately, we've had a couple of years where there have been 1 or 2, and a couple of years where there were a little bit more than that. And I don't want to make light of this, but every dog that dies is a sad thing. but when you consider that if you're talking about a race that starts with, almost 70 mushers, that's well over 1,000 dogs. And so, to have one dog die in the race or even two dogs die is not a really high number given how many dogs there are and how long the race goes on. But as I said, we always want there to be 0 dog deaths, and whenever there is a dog that dies, people want to find out what happened and is this something that we can prevent in the future.
And I'm sure the more astute fans know that these dogs are very well checked out before they are able to race. Not only do they have to have a vet check by a veterinarian that is approved by Iditarod and checked very thoroughly with that, but they also all have to undergo blood work and EKGs for their heart. And it's not uncommon where a dog will not pass one or the other of those 3, where they don't pass either the vet check, the EKG, or the blood test, and that often rules dogs out because of genetic problems or those sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily see under normal conditions of dogdom. And think about that, Alex. Again, just not to bear light on this at all, but these dogs are checked and rechecked probably more thoroughly than 99% of every pet dog in America. I would bet that most people that are listening have never had an EKG run on their dog, and maybe their dog is a hardcore canine athlete. Maybe they're doing agility or dock diving or competition obedience or something like that is very strenuous on a dog, and they don't do that type of testing. So I think as many safeguards as possible are done to protect the dogs before they leave on the trail, and of course all of the vet care that is performed on the trail, antibiotics and for muscle problems and physical therapy and massages and all these things that are going on. These dogs are taken care of about as best as they could. Do you agree?
Absolutely. They are, it's really the gold standard. And occasionally something like this happens. And as I said, we try to learn from it, figure out if it's something that's preventable, and then move forward to try to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future.
Right. Alex, moving on here, this has been a relatively slow story day or news day in regards to stories from the trail or happenings on the trail as we work our way towards Nome with the rest of the mushers. But I do have an update on a story that we talked about earlier in our coverage. It was about the French musher Marcel Frisano. I believe it's how you say that. Is that correct, Alex?
Yeah.
It
was the one who chased off the bison.
Yes, she was the musher that chased off the bison in the Farewell Burn area of the Iditarod in that first third of the race, and she chased them off with an axe. And I happened to be at our local Dog Mushers Club this afternoon, and a good friend of mine, her name is Marty, came up to me and says, "Hey, I've got a story for you about Iditarod." She said that a French musher's handler came up to her, didn't know much English, and realized that, she was running around downtown Anchorage, realizing that she had forgotten her axe, which is a mandatory piece of gear in your sled on Iditarod. You have to have it at every checkpoint. So this young lady was running around, oh my goodness, frantic about not having an axe. So my friend Marty took it upon herself to go to the local hardware store and pick up an axe for her. And she looked around and looked around and looked around and couldn't figure out who this musher was, because you know how frantic it is at the ceremonial start in Anchorage on Saturday. Well, one thing led to another, and they wound up meeting up and figuring out who it was that did not have the axe in their sled, and it happened to be Marcel Frisano. So my friend Marty delivered the brand new axe to her and, put it in her sled bag, and off they went on the ceremonial start. But lo and behold, this axe actually came into play and potentially saved a sled dogs team's life well down the trail. I thought that was an absolutely remarkable story. What do you think?
I absolutely love that. And unfortunately, Marcel is in the news again today because she was we have 3 scratches today, and she was one of the ones who scratched outside Shaktoolik. She still had 12 dogs going, but that is certainly a great, great story.
You only find these nuggets if you're in the mushing community, and I think that's our show's special. We try to tell those stories that aren't typically covered in the news. I know on Facebook today there was quite a thread going along about the coverage with Iditarod, and we've talked about it many times, sort of dropping off after that first 10 or 20 or so mushers that get into Nome. Of course, the news outlets, they have other commitments and other jobs that they have to cover, and they can't have people on the trail 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. But I think that having little stories like that is such a great thing about Iditarod, and I think it's a great thing about our coverage as well. We try to find those stories that a lot of people just don't hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go through the other 2 scratches. Rob Cook, who was running a team of Siberians, he also scratched. He was at the Tripod Flats cabin, and he activated his non-emergency signal on his tracking device. So a bunch of local residents from Caltag came and helped Rob, get his 12 dogs back to the checkpoint at Caltag where he scratched. He had a stomach bug earlier in the race and was not doing very well back at Nikolai. So I presume this was sort of a continuation of that. And then Alan Eichens, who mushes to raise awareness for various pediatric diseases, scratched as well in Koyuk. He had 14 dogs in harness, and he had crashed into some hard ice, injured his arms, and I believe broke one of his hands. So he made it all the way to Koyuk, and then didn't feel that he could continue, and that it was good for his dog team. So he scratched as well.
And then, as you mentioned, with Marcel scratching as well, what was her issue? Do you know?
I'm not sure. Excuse me, I'm not sure. The press release just said for her safety and the good of her team, so which is a fairly typical thing. So I imagine we'll find out a little bit more about them there in the next day or two.
Are you looking at your computer? Do you know how many scratches to date?
Yeah, there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So we had 8 coming in. We had 8 as of last night, and now up to 11. So that still leaves 56 competing.
I was just going to say it's relatively typical to have about 10 to 15% of the folks scratch, I would say. So 10% would be about 7 mushers, and then 15 would be about 12 or so. Was that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And of course, this is
so we didn't have a lot of scratches. I was going to say we didn't have a lot of scratches early in the race, and in the past few races we've had a lot of early scratches. We seem to be making up for it a little bit in the past couple of days.
Right.
Last night when we were on the air, there were 10 people who had finished, and we're now up to 25. So it's just a little bit under half of the teams are in right now.
Right. And, it's very typical, especially as you get to the middle to the back of the pack, that a lot of mushers will team up with each other and travel together down the trail. I've been reading a lot of stories on Facebook on the mushers' Facebook pages and the like where, so-and-so's traveling with so-and-so and, enjoying each other's company at the checkpoints and whatnot. That's a very common occurrence as they travel because, of course, not only is it still a race and it's still somewhat competitive, but when you're in that position, whether you're in the middle or the back of the pack, it's always nice to have some company back there, which is a great way to travel by dog team. If you have somebody that you can hang out with at checkpoints and help each other out if there's issues on the trail, whether it be overflow or, sleep deprivation or whatever, if you have somebody that can help you out. I did want to mention, I know we mentioned this last night relatively quickly, Alex, before we talk about our musher profile for this evening, is about that Rule 36, which is a competitive rule that comes into play where the back of the pack mushers really have to be cognizant of what's happening at the front. Do you know right off the top of your head sort of the gist of that rule, and do you think it will come into play at all during this year's Iditarod?
I don't think it'll come into play during this year's Iditarod, but it used to be that there were specific times that were spelled out. So you would have to be, you couldn't be more than so many hours behind at Uniloclete and so many hours behind at Caltag. And that was changed a few years ago so that it's a little bit vaguer and lets the race marshal and the race officials sort of interpret it. And the reason for this rule is that if there are people who are very, very far behind, it takes a considerable amount of manpower to keep the checkpoints open. And at a certain point, it doesn't really make sense for Iditarod to keep the checkpoints open and to keep people and vet techs and checkers and staff there. So they want to be moving that up the trail. I don't think that's going to come into account in this race just because there's no one single musher who's very, very far behind. And it tends to be invoked or to have the race marshal pressure someone into scratching when there's one person who's really far behind. Generally speaking, if there's 2 or 3 people who are traveling together, the race marshal tends to let them keep going as long as they are making forward progress and they're moving and they're not camped out at one checkpoint for days at a time. So I'm hoping that that both Steve Watkins and Tara will be able to make it all the way through to Nome.
And it's not uncommon if it's not sort of a rule of Iditarod where many of those checkers and staff and vet techs and everybody at one checkpoint further down the trail will hopscotch down the trail. Say if they're working in McGrath early part of the race, they may be flown or moved to several checkpoints down the line and then do their job all over again at that next checkpoint. And it sort of folds in on of itself as they're working their way down, sort of like a little machine. Things are happening at the front and then everything just sort of pushes together and moves up the trail as the mushers continue. And like you said, it's a considerable effort to keep, especially those more remote checkpoints like Iditarod and, Elam and, Cripple and all those other ones on different years as they work their way up, because there's just nobody there to support things. They really set up a little community as they're working their way down the trail, and I think that's one of the main reasons for this rule. And I know you mentioned, Alex, that there is a process that happens to do this. There are phone calls that have to be made by the race marshal to the competitor, and agreements have to be made, and it has to be a formal process. It's just not something where the checker at some checkpoint says, "Okay, Mr. Smith, you're a little too far behind. You're done for this year. Pack it up and go home." It does not happen that way, and that's a good thing. It has to be formal and making sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed for sure. Alex, before we run out of time, I know you have a very special story tonight. He has been on our show a couple of times. What an amazing guy this is, not only on the Iditarod Trail, but off as well. We are talking about Larry Doherty tonight. What do you have on Larry?
So Larry Doherty, as you mentioned, has been on Mushing Radio a few times. Very, very personable, a great interview, wonderful story. He is a radiation oncologist in Anchorage. He's run Iditarod twice before. In 2016, he very famously veered off course and had to loop back around, came in 63rd place. Last year came in 44th place, had absolutely no intention of being in the race this year. And the reason I wanted to talk about him, and, you know, there's all sorts of stuff with him. He does adventure climbing and climbs mountains with his kids, and he carries prayer flags on his sled for people going through treatment and people who have been patients of his who have died, and just a really wonderful guy. But the reason I wanted to talk about him tonight is that he was not supposed to be running Iditarod this year. And as longtime fans or followers of sled dog racing may know, Jason Campo, when he was running the Yukon Quest, had a fairly bad accident and had a pretty serious head injury. And Jason, when he had this injury, had stopped to help out fellow musher Hugh Neff, who had, I believe, a loose dog or a loose dog team. And so Jason was helping Hugh stop and get his dogs under control, fell and hit his head, and then was trying to figure out if it would still be okay for him to run Iditarod this year. Meanwhile, was doing all of the things that you do to get ready for Iditarod, including getting all of his drop bags in place, getting all of his food, you know, having his dogs looked after, running with his dogs. And then really just about 2 weeks before the start of Iditarod, he was out for a run with his dogs, and he realized that he couldn't actually take care of them, and he wasn't going to be able to run the race. So he called Larry Doherty and said, my team is all ready. I don't want them to miss out on running this race. Will you run my team in Iditarod? And Larry Doherty just said, of course I will. And so Jason's father drove the dog truck with all of Jason's dogs from Canada over to Eagle River, where Larry Doherty is, and got there, I believe, 10 days before the ceremonial start. So Larry and Jason's dog team had what he's described as sort of a speed dating period where they did a lot of runs. The weekend before the race, they ran 150 miles or so. He was doing a lot of runs with them during the week. Larry had told everyone that he wasn't going to be running Iditarod this year, and then all of a sudden he was. He had to get used to dogs and the dog team. I think it's fair to say that these dogs, if they'd been running with Jason, would have been much more competitive, but Jason didn't want the dogs to miss out on having that experience of running this 1,000-mile race. So on the ceremonial start, Larry Doherty, even though he's American, was born in Utah, grew up all over the place, Colorado, and lived in Washington and Florida, and now in Alaska, was carrying a Canadian flag for Jason and was wearing a hat, a red hat with a white maple leaf and a homemade sign on his hat that said, "For Jason," during the ceremonial start. And he is now resting in White Mountain. He is in 38th place, which is, a very, very solid middle-of-the-pack standing, but actually I think kind of amazing given that he literally did not know these dogs at all until 10 days before the Iditarod started. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, about Larry in particular tonight, is there's a lot of things about this particular story that I think represent the best of Iditarod and sled dog racing. Jason got hurt because he had stopped to help a fellow musher. And then he reached out to another fellow musher because he didn't want his dog team not to be able to have this experience of going on Iditarod. And then Larry very, very quickly, without giving it all that much thought, said, yes, I will do this for you. And we talk a lot about how there's kind of a fraternity, a mushing fraternity, and there's, people who will disagree wholeheartedly and vehemently and have political arguments on Facebook, will turn around and do really astonishing, wonderful things for each other just because they want to make sure that everyone is properly taken care of. So I wanted to make sure that we talked about Larry and what he's doing in this race this year, because I think that really represents some of the best of what Iditarod is all about.
Alex, first off, what a testament to tenacity for Larry. I know just a few days before he found out that he was going to be running in the race, he was taking pictures of his kids skiing and, just doing the dad thing, enjoying life, having a great time this winter. He and I follow each other on Facebook, and the next thing you know, he's pretty much packing his bag, so to speak, and is out on the Iditarod Trail. But you're so right. This really is sort of a kind of a capsule of how Iditarod mushers in general are to each other. Just so much of a helping attitude that so many of us have, and that's what makes this sport very special. And it's one of the reasons why I stay and do it for as long as I have, just that community that is around it. Secondly, I cannot second cannot second enough what you said about Larry and his story and the way he carries himself. I have to say, he's been on our show, I think, 3 times. And not only is he such an awesome guy to talk to and a great interview, but he and I spoke, I don't know how many times after the show had aired about, if he could ever share the links and promote our show and just do all these other things. He went above and beyond, not only being a guest, but becoming a Facebook friend and a social media friend and, talking off air and that sort of thing. Just a great guy. I just can't say enough about at least my meetings of him and my talking to him. I would love to have that guy as my wingman in just about anything, whether it be, as a doctor for an oncology or, a musher in need, or just a friend hanging out at the local bar and having a beer and enjoying the time just chewing the fat together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that given all of the things that he has done, that this is a guy who just has a lot of stories.
Right, for sure. Excellent stuff. I am glad we were able to talk about him tonight. We have just about, 4 or 5 more shows before we end our daily coverage. I'm always looking forward to who we're going to talk about next. You have such amazing stories and people that you pick on for our mushers profiles. I love this part of the show, and I'm so glad that we do it as well. Anything else in closing? I know we're a couple of minutes over here tonight. Anything you want to mention before we go? I want to say again, it looks like we're probably going to have all of the teams in before the banquet, and certainly by tomorrow night's show, I think we're going to have, I think it's possible we will have 40 or more mushers in, and so it's really great to see all of these people moving up the trail and getting into Nome. Right, and I want to second that as well. The Iditarod is not over. Like you said, we still have well more than half of the folks out there. There's still a lot of cheering to do for these guys and gals. If you are an avid Facebook user, get out there and check out all these people's Facebook page and profiles and like their pages and comment on them and give congratulations and all that, because not only are the mushers out there working hard, but often they will get off the trail and read every single Facebook post and respond to every message, and they really love hearing from you guys, even though you're commenting on a Tuesday where they can't, or I guess it's Wednesday or Thursday now. I have no idea. It's been a long week for me. But they will see those comments in the days to come, and they will much relish that support that you give them. So get out there and support everybody that's out on the trail. In my opinion, these guys in the middle to the back of the pack, I think that's there's a lot of the true stories of Iditarod are really happening back there. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to find out about a lot of these folks and what they're all about outside of mushing. Alex, it's a pleasure as always. I will talk to you tomorrow night. And for all of the folks that are listening tonight, thank you very much. Make sure you check out our Facebook page at DogWorks Radio, and check us out over on dogworksradio.com. We have about 9 years of episodes there on all sorts of topics relating to dogs. Alex, I'll talk to you tomorrow, and good evening.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.
If you like our podcast, there are a few things you can do. You can take a couple of minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also check out all of our DogWorks Radio sponsors and promotions in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go over to Facebook, like our Facebook page, and one last thing, please tell all of your friends by spreading the word about DogWorks Radio. Thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate you.
DogWorks Radio is produced by Robert Forto. Logo art by Angry Squirrel Studios. DogWorks Radio is produced in conjunction with KVRF 89.7 in Palmer, Alaska.
For dog training advice, you can contact Alaska Dog Works at 907-841-1686 or visit their website at alaskadogworks.com. If you have a show idea or would like to be a guest, please contact us by sending an email to live@dogworksradio.com.